I don't think we need this microphone, do we? Can we? I think it's off. Lovely. Let's put it right away. Oh, excuse me. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues from the Museum of Anthropology. There's some seats here, by the way. There are 1, 2, 3, 4 seats if anybody's... I won't mind if you leave early. There probably aren't many of you in this auditorium who haven't read or haven't planned to read Essie Adugyan's wonderful novel, Half-Blood Blues. Nominated for the Man Booker Prize and a Governor General's Award, it won the 2011 Giller Prize for fiction, and it tells the story of a group of black musicians before and after the Second World War, from the jazz clubs of pre-war Berlin to occupied Paris to the rainy streets of modern-day Baltimore. The novel hasn't anything to do with Canada whatsoever, but Adugyan, based in Victoria, allows herself one very Canadian joke. The protagonist, Sid, desperate to get his cab driver to stop talking, is asked where he lives. And I quote, "Not London, England," I said, "London, Ontario, in Canada." The cabbie's eyes sort of glazed over. Canada kills any conversation quick. It's a little trick of mine. Well, it's not just Canada. If it's any consolation, museums too have this silencing effect on people. High vaults and cupolas rarely encourage chat. From the start, the entire design of museums appears to have had the sole intention of imposing silence and awe on the visitor. Reverence was demanded, though in many cases less for the objects of the past than for those rich and oh so admirable people who put them there. There's a perfectly good reason we all know the Getty as the Getty. Now, what this silence tells us is that museum spaces, and perhaps by extension all public spaces, are already mediated. They exercise their influence before anyone has seen or done anything inside them. It's easy to forget. Many imagine the museum to be an empty container, something like a large piece of Tupperware in which you can place lots of cultural tidbits that need preserving. More recently, the architectural brilliance of many contemporary museums has been designed to work with a collection inside and communicate key messages. One thinks immediately of Daniel Libeskind's powerful Jewish museum in Berlin, with its jagged light, its narrowing perspectives, its blocked corridors. The building is the content it intends to display, or in the case of the Holocaust, notates architecturally a loss and a terror the museum is unable to display. But even here, before we get to understand the specific meaning intended by a Libeskind or a Frank Gehry, the building exerts its force upon us. We approach, we admire, we quite literally look up, and we begin already in a position of silent veneration. I want to start with the building because museums can focus a little too narrowly on the words they use to explain things. And yet, how collections are displayed and the buildings that house them are just as important as any caption or text panel set nearby. It's a mistake no visitor ever makes. The building is the first thing that has an impact on their experience. But we professionals become so accustomed to our environment that we forget the influence it yields. There are, of course, many approaches one might take, and Libeskind's Jewish Museum is deliberately polemical. It shouts. It shakes you up. It's an argument in architecture that grabs you by the lapels as you pass through. Some people may not like this, but one aspect of it we might agree on. A sense of awe is not in itself bad. I want people to feel the drama and the excitement of culture. Museums are inspiring and need to feel that way. Part of the appeal of a museum like my own, the Royal BC Museum in Victoria, is its pleasing situation. How many of you actually have been there? Sure. Let's do it the other way. Who hasn't been there? So a couple of board members and... You could say the building honors the location as much as the stories inside. And what you learn in the building is, in the best cases, reinforced by the environment in which you learn it. So 18th and 19th century museums, here you've got the front entrance of the British Museum, even the most daunting were onto something with their awe-inspiring facades. They announced that something important was going on inside. Creating an oppressive silence may no longer be what we want from them, but silence in itself is not a bad thing. As a forum for welcoming discussion, it makes the museum space all the more engaging to visitors. There's something to be said for leaving room for others to speak. Silence is also an opportunity. Acknowledging the shifting tensions between insistence and opportunity in the space itself is, I would argue, one of the ways museums can reframe themselves for the modern visitor. And it's not just bricks and mortar that determine how museum spaces work. Let me give you an example. One of the new voices in museums in the 21st century is that of technology. Museums increasingly provide independent digital pathways through their galleries. Apps, headset tours, QR access codes, audio and visual guides. These digital directives are both highly determined, since the museum usually provides the content, and yet highly undetermined, for the visitor can put together any number of journeys through the collection. As more digital content is made available to them, growing numbers of visitors are doing so, and that is only likely to increase. With ever larger numbers of headsets covering ever larger number of ears, a new type of museum space, or perhaps a new definition of that space, is about to emerge, where each visitor moves entirely on their own, doing their own thing. It's highly tailored and admirably free in the choice it offers. But perhaps now is the moment, before it is utterly embedded in our visitor environment, to ask, do we want the museum experience to be completely autonomous? Are we creating a less mediated experience with more choice, or an unchallenging exercise in self-absorption? Does too much choice mean you only encounter what already interests you? Is this selection, or is this shopping? Encounter may be the key word here in trying to be flexible and move away from a dominant curatorial voice, in trying to open up their spaces and not overdetermine matters for visitors. Museums risk losing any sense of dialogue. So keen are we not to impose meanings that we risk retreating into silence. Instead of engagement, we have escape. Instead of community, we have solitude. It's the risk of a decentered approach to the museum. And I think it's probably not what people want when they gather in a public space such as a museum. My concern really is that in fearing how we, the museum guardians, frame the history, frame the knowledge, frame archives and collections we hold, we mustn't imagine some innocent state where no mediation is possible. The worst thing we could do is become tentative and passive. We have instead to understand clearly the implications of what we are doing and seize the museum framework as part of our expressive potential. The building, as I've argued, is one such frame that can encourage and suggest from a general sense of inspiration and scale of importance to a more specific thematic set of meanings. The museum's intellectual scaffolding must also find a strong foothold between the open-ended and the absentee. We can't change the collections every 2 minutes, but we can invigorate the intellectual life of the museum quite easily with new topics and new approaches. Take language, for example. Take language as a way into museum collections. Abstract concepts are not the usual approach to objects, where the materiality of our displays tends to skip away from the intangible when we explain them. We remain rooted in the material past. But if museum objects represent points of contact with the groups of people who made or encountered them, language, too, in all its varieties, is a very potent representation of those same communities. But is language of much use as a museum topic, where people come to look at things? Well, when you walk into the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, one of the first things you will see as you turn left, and you can hardly avoid it, is a wall of video screens. This welcome wall greets you in no less than 150 Native American languages. You are showered in the indigenous languages of the Americas. It's wonderful, and it also immediately makes a very useful intellectual point. No museum, even one as powerful as the Smithsonian, is ever going to be able to present to you that many cultures in one building in one afternoon. Even to understand a select few with the correct weight and feeling, you need to place them in the context of these many missing languages and cultures. The welcome wall is a clever device. You start your museum visit by seizing in a very quick and graphic fashion just how much there is to know, and then you make your selection. And it does that not with objects, but with a more abstract, yet contiguous idea about language. The Royal BC Museum is embarking on its own display of First Nations languages in British Columbia. The project is one of the first ventures to emerge from a joint memorandum of understanding between the museum and the First Peoples Cultural Council. It is the latest in a long history of rewarding collaborations between the museum and British Columbia's First Nations. Such collaboration expands the museum's voice to include the voices of other contributors, particularly those with first-hand experience and knowledge of cultural practice. It fills the silence with sound and enables a more multidimensional approach to how we display First Nations cultures to our visitors. But this exhibition is more ambitious. Like the Smithsonian's Welcome Wall, it aims to bring the uncontainable into the museum container. For us, it's not just a question of First Nations languages, but of the worldviews they represent, about land and water, family and social structure, moral values and ways of life. Paradoxically, it is language that often gives us access to the unspoken, or as is often the case in First Nations languages, to the unwritten. With language as our focus, all kinds of new questions arise. What place do we give in history to the unregistered? How do we preserve the undefined and the uninscribed? What might we be missing if we ignore it? As the writer Robert Crouch puts in a collection of essays entitled The Lovely Treachery of Words, we are finding that, in his words, the unnaming allows the naming. The local pride speaks. The oral tradition speaks its tentative nature its freedom from the authorized text. We are learning that language gives us access to information that objects alone and the histories that surround them might not convey. One of the exhibition's goals is to show that not everything can be translated into other languages. And it is here, perhaps, that we find ourselves at the heart of our most cherished beliefs. Such concepts are the hardest to articulate, the source of every culture's myths and origin tales, its deepest thinking. They are of the essence of who we are. As Northrop Frye wrote in his study of the Canadian imagination, our myths are expressions of concern, of man's care for his own destiny and heritage, his sense of the supreme importance of preserving his community. Lose the language in which to express such beliefs, and you lose that very bond that ties a community together. Preserving such language is one of the reasons we want to put on this exhibition. I cite this example as an instance of how an innovative lens, such as language, can represent the collection and the knowledge it represents. Change the prism and you change the content. No one imagines it is practical or desirable to keep altering museum displays as times and fashion change. But what you can do is to reintroduce them, suggest new frames or angles, new starting points for thinking about what is and isn't there. Language is one idea for recontextualizing the collection intellectually, but there is no getting away from the fact that museums are filled with things. Unlike the university, where the horizon of knowledge extends as far as scholarly minds wish to travel, museum knowledge is embedded in objects themselves. I can travel with them, but I have to say they make for a very heavy trunk. The shape of things is, of course, their great power. And the pleasure of museums is that knowledge is embodied. History is palpable. We often ask you not to touch, but the reality of the past is there, before your eyes, in any handmade pot or curiously fashioned piece of jewellery, or in the case of the Royal BC Museum, a lot of guns and gold. What we say about objects and how we present them is highly influential. You could rewrite and redesign the exact same collection and end up with radically different museums. But even more, as a means of reframing the collection, are the prospects of bringing together different collections, physically, intellectually, and electronically. One of the special exhibitions we have planned at the Royal BC Museum is on the gold rushes of British Columbia. It'll open in 2015. It's an exhibition about movement and looks at one of the founding activities that went into making British Columbia the place it is today, bringing people and influences, turning this particular stretch of land and water into a dreamscape of wealth and personal prosperity. It's a very British Columbia story. Or is it? One of the ways of breaking out of the parochialism of museum knowledge is to imagine the same exhibition put on somewhere else. What does an exhibition on gold rushes look like in California or Australia? Why not bring those elements in? We'll never really understand British Columbia's place in the world unless we see how other regions were shaken up by the same adventures. We hope the exhibition will do just that by drawing on collections from as far away as China and Australia, from Britain and the southern United States. My larger point, I suppose, is that collections need imagination and can move physically and increasingly digitally. They're not static, and what we've already said about them can change. One of the Royal BC Museum's great projects is a planned atlas of British Columbia. It's a kind of giant digital museum that will bring together archives and collections from across the province, including those of private collectors, is an attempt to recombine dispersed knowledge and dispersed digital efforts and make it available to everyone for free, however remote their location. We could never hope to bring this material together physically, but digitizing has meant not just that information can be stored, but that astonishing new possibilities for intelligent archiving and comparative research are now arising. It's such an exciting moment for museums, for libraries and archives, and will, among its many effects, send us back to the physical collections, asking new questions, needing to make new descriptions, pursuing new scientific and other investigations. What this joining up of physical collections demands is a freedom from the traditional boundaries of museum, archival, and research work. Those can be disciplinary boundaries or the boundaries of agreed thought. They're sometimes the boundaries of professional culture that so easily become ossified as a high-minded but unyielding set of protocols. There are few things more discouraging for a young curator full of fresh ideas than being told in no uncertain terms, "This is how we do things round here." The only appropriate response, it seems to me, is change. Those boundaries are also, in a very conventional sense, regional. When we bring collections together, we're going to have to let down our guard. We need to open the museum up as if we are to ensure that knowledge remains vital, comprehensive, and relevant. You can't just stay in your place, working quietly in your corner, looking after a collection that no one really can enjoy. You need to travel. You need to look out. You need to let outside influences in. The Atlas of British Columbia that we're proposing will include as many dispersed artifacts and records that we can find, including those tucked away in our stores, or the many stores and from abroad. The exhibition on gold and gold rushes will draw on everything from immigrant histories from China to trade routes across America. In both cases, understanding British Columbia involves engaging not just with the province, but with the world. Even a topic such as language in British Columbia needs to break out of its provincial encyclopedia. In an age when people are bouncing images and music across the world, where even the US president learns to move in Gangnam Style, not very well according to his wife, museums need to be international and keep an international perspective. They need to be connected. Allow me to finish by reading you a short passage from Audrey Thomas's novel, Intertidal Life. It's set on Galiano Island, and I quote, "Alice took out a small book called A Spanish Voyage to Vancouver. Since coming to the island, she had been interested in the Spanish exploration of the northwest coast. The island has a Spanish name, as did some of the others in the archipelago, and it amused her to think of these Spanish captains coming through Paulia Pass, all those men sailing the oceans of the world. Did their wives hang on their coattails? Did their wives hang on their tails of Indians and waterfalls, strange ceremonies and strange sights, the way Desdemona hung on the words of Othello? What if women had been the explorers? Imagine a ship then, full of women, trained in the use of all those wonderful instruments, quadrants, chronometers, the azimuth compass, knowing how to steer by the stars, knowing the difference between an artificial horizon and a real one." Audrey Thomas. It's a brilliant passage. Thomas reminds us that in case we forget, British Columbia's imaginative heritage connects to everything, from early navigational instruments developed in China and the Middle East to Shakespeare's Othello. And reading her reminds me that we need, when trying to frame the past, the future, and the present, to keep our perspectives wide. If an exhibition at the Royal BC Museum is going to talk about languages in the province, we will need to point out the Kwakwaka'wak, the Nishka, the Tlingit. There's a whole long list of languages to discuss, and one of them is Spanish. Thank you all very much for listening. Thank you. Yes, of course.
A few minutes for questions, and I imagine there are some questions in the audience.
Vicky in the front row. Vicky in the front row.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating, wonderful, very stimulating. You focused in your talk primarily on, I would say, the public programming aspects of the work of museums and archives and other cultural heritage institutions. And I wondered if you could reflect just for a moment on the acquisition, the building up of the collections, and in particular, if you might reflect a little on the challenges for archives, where records are increasingly created in native or born digital format, and how we create the infrastructure to actually acquire those, bring those into the kind of space that you've been talking about.
You're touching on so many subjects, acquisitions, collections, policy, and of course collections, archival collections, digitally born collections, etc. They're all, all intertwined, and actually you could probably write a book on all three subjects. I think, first of all, to talk a little bit about generally in acquisitions. I'm a sort of museum director that doesn't believe widely that the museum has to acquire everything. I believe my philosophy of museums is such that there isn't a huge amount of money for acquisitions these days, although social history museums in particular and natural history museums, sometimes collections are quite cheap to acquire. You send a scientist into the field to acquire dragonflies. You're paying in a way, the cost of a salary. So it's not that these collections cost a lot. But reflecting on acquisitions, the idea that a museum needs to acquire everything and go through the province like a vacuum cleaner, and it needs everything. Well, I really question that. I think in this day and age, the idea of a dispersed collection where you can borrow things depending on how you're assembling them together, you don't need to have the object in your care. And in a way, to many museum directors, they don't like to hear that type of philosophy, but it's one that I believe very strongly, having worked in the developing world where 90% of Africa's culture is not in Africa. I think the idea that you can return things, show things, present things, return them. So the whole idea of acquisition needs to be very carefully always thought through. Clearly, archives have, by law, a mandate, especially ones that are linked to government. They become the repository for records, whether you like it or not. They're coming. In the case of British Columbia, you probably know that government records have not been passed to the archives for over 10 years. There's a sort of build-up somewhere in the province. I'm not sure whether anyone's noticed it. But there must be a hell of a build-up somewhere happening, and at some point that collection that will need to be released to the BC archives, and we will face that issue. But clearly digital is here, and therefore you have no choice but to organize yourselves to have a digital department that can cope with it. We have, in our restructuring of the museum, we have a whole department of digital preservation, knowing that this is already a key issue, knowing that we have collections that need specific care, whether they're film collections, audiovisual collections, etc. And so you have to face up to the future. You can't bury it under the carpet. So I think as being a responsible archive, you have to look after those collections too. But the idea that you need to bid for all those great things, I mean, recently we wanted to acquire a gold miner's prospector's diary that came up for sale in New York. It was very interesting. It was from the 1858 Thompson River gold rush. There was a daguerreotype with that was for sale of the prospector too. It was a very interesting acquisition. And rather than compete with other organizations, we decided to contact a whole series of organizations, say, why do we buy it all together, acquire it jointly? And I have to say there was a frightfully good attitude here. Everybody was up for it. This idea that we all have to compete for the same thing, I think is something of the past. I think museums are growing up here very, very quickly. Any other reflections or questions? You could be nasty. You can be... There's a lady right at the back. I can't see your name tag, but... Gwen.
I guess this is really a reflection, maybe you can reflect back. It sounded to me that I was thinking that there was kind of a tension in museums between the scientific approach and, well, between science and art, really. And that there must be a kind of a tension, and I wanted to hear your thoughts on that. My impression is that you're leaning more towards the art in thinking about museum design, but there must be a strong component of trying to, in a sense, objectively describe the materials and make them available for research. How do you see that play?
I think it's a very valid question. I think it's particularly valid for an institution like the Royal BC Museum that collects, has so many different collection strands. So I'm sorry if I gave that impression, because I think, one of the joys of the Royal BC Museum is its natural history collections. The issue, though, with the Royal BC Museum was that historically it was two institutions. There seemed to be a research institution, much like a university without students, and a sort of attraction, a public attraction, where principally concentrating on bringing exhibitions from abroad. And the idea of these two institutions collaborating was actually non-existent, I would say. There were some attempts to do it. In a way, here, there is a new reflection that the generation of new knowledge is hugely important, that there is a scientific tradition at the museum, and principally there's some collection strengths that don't appear elsewhere. They don't appear, for example, at your university. And, for example, the type collections. So these are the sort of the master collection to which other collections then are classified, taxonomic collections in particular. Those things are considerable strengths. The herbaria, for example, great strength in botany. But there needs to be a reflection on the type of research that happens in institutions. And the idea that is completely unregulated, the idea that scientists come to work and just follow their instincts and their hobbies and their interests, I think that's a sort of an old-fashioned model, certainly one that I don't subscribe to. I really believe that you have a research strategy. That research strategy is based around significant public outputs or government outputs, etc., and that actually all the research is there to have certain outputs. And in the same way that if you're a professor, I'm sure it's the same in Canada, but certainly in Europe, you have to produce your papers, your books, etc. Otherwise, you can't call yourself a professor when they come round to assessing yourself. And obviously, we professors hate that because it means so much work. But it's worth it in the end to have the prof in front of your name. And presumably there may be a salary that comes with it too. But I think it's a very valid point. But let me just say I'm a great champion. And I get one of the things that excited me when I ran the National Museums of South Africa. I ran the South African Museum, which is the greatest collection of fish I've ever come across in a museum. They have one of every fish in Africa. And unfortunately, they were kept in alcohol. I say unfortunately because it meant that some staff were drinking the alcoholic specimens at the time, would you believe. But it was one of the great collections. It is one of the great collections of the world. And I think one of the excitements that I had about coming here was to really look and understand at and here the collections play such a useful role. We know that, climate is changing. It's affecting, you can look at sort of the radioactivity in specimens over time and see how, the planet's becoming more radioactive, or, having a look at all these, DNA toxins, all sorts of opportunities to look at collections and just see how the world's changing. So it does play a very vital role in science too. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we're finishing because I've been Professor.
Well, one thing I was interested in is a while ago we had a First Nations Truth and Reconciliation meeting here, and one of the speakers described his association with the landscape. So for him, the landscape meant so much more than I had ever realized. And I just wondered how it was the things that you can't acquire in a museum, like a landscape. How do you bring that, as you're trying to tell the stories, how do you put the language with it? For him, the language was so embedded and tied up with the landscape. So just a question on how you would...
Well, of course, if I were an artist standing up here, I'd say, well, you're completely wrong. So much of Canadian painting has been influenced by the landscape. Very often, you look at the group of 7, you never see a person in any of the landscapes. It's just landscape, and you actually do see that landscape. I see it from my window every day. There's something very Canadian, very un-European, almost un-Scandinavian. It's more Canadian than... So there are lots of ways in which you can bring a landscape. Obviously, it depends what the objectives of your museum ultimately are, what the mission of your museum is, and whether you're there to inspire, whether you're there to educate, whether you just exist, so to speak. But, geology collection, if there was a geologist here, they'd say, hey, what are you talking about? Just look at this. You could get lost in a piece of rock looking at a piece of rock. We think they're intangible concepts that you can't get because just size is everything. But clever museums, you look at the Museum of Rome, for example, Zaha Hadid's designed this extraordinary panorama window onto Rome. I mean, it really is quite extraordinary. Bring the Grand Egyptian Museum in Cairo, which has, at the end of the Pyramid Plateau, just a window. Because it doesn't have the collections, it has this window looking out onto the Pyramid Plateau with one sculpture this big of the architect who built the pyramids. So they've brought the landscape into the building. So architecture can play its role. The gentleman here with that.
Hi, David Woodell. Thanks very much for your talk. I enjoyed it a lot. My question was coming from your point about how the tangibility of the museum visit forces people to visit a particular cultural topic they're interested in, but are then confronted by the fact that they don't know everything about that topic and maybe unknown topics particularly. But with the digital visit, there's so much customizability and maneuverability, searchability of users. Is it not difficult in some way, presenting new challenges, to have users be confronted with the fact that there are things they don't know in the digital environment, in those digital visits, in atlases that you talked about?
I'm sure that's true. It's bound to be. I mean, it's one of the great joys of going, surfing, is that there's so much we don't know. But the knowledge is there, and I think that's what's the sort of reassuring, is that somebody's trying to piece together this knowledge interestingly. I mean, the conference, museums, and the web. I don't know whether I don't know whether you work in museums, etc., or you're studying museums, etc. But each year they give out awards, and I don't have time to attend the conference. But I always look at the award winners every year, and I go through every single award, and the creativity of the digital media. It's so much more than we present on our websites, etc. The creativity of being able to blend and mesh and bring together in a very, often artistic, but very often engaging and participatory way. I mean, often when we're confronted with very static, passive pages, I think that's where you become somewhat sort of soul-destroyed by the museum experience, if you like. But those are very good examples, and I think we as directors, I think we're often, we always want more money to be able to put into that type of activity. And I think this is where partnerships with, the Google Art Project and so on are so helpful to us. So it's an emerging thing, really. There was a lady somewhere at the back. Yes, madame.
I'm very intrigued by your idea of called it both the Atlas of BC and the Encyclopedia of British Columbia. And your idea that it would be open. So are you looking at collaborating with other institutions to bring together material? I'm thinking specifically, I work at the Museum of Anthropology. You have all of the contextual images from all, in your archives of villages up and down the coast. You and the Art Museum and us and all kinds of other. We've collected the material from those. So to see these things interacting with each other.
You see, the public couldn't care less if those collections at the Museum of Anthropology or at the Royal BC Museum, they want to see the image, they may want to see the object in context, etc. And I think we have to move to this type of sharing and take it somewhere it hasn't been yet. I think that's all ahead of us in terms of movement and offering it up for the public to use. The idea also of charging. I mean, currently, when I look at my income line for licensing of images, etc., obviously I get very excited, especially when government cuts its grants, etc. But actually, the future has to be to make all these things freely accessible to everybody. And so you have to think, how do we arrive at that opportunity where your image is being used by every school child and can be downloaded and I think the museums in London took that step a couple of years ago. The Victoria and Albert Museum, you can download every single image of every single object for free. Obviously, they lose a lot of income, but clearly they make it up elsewhere and probably in goodwill, amongst other things. Right at the back, the charming lady with glasses. And, it's a gentleman, I think.
There is one here.
It's been a charming lady beside her.
Thanks a lot for the talk and for especially taking the time to take as many questions as you have. My question relates to comments you made at the front end of your talk relating to increasing desire, perhaps on a segment of the public, for an increasingly user-directed experience, and the tension that creates in perhaps atomizing your visitors, given the public mission to be a public commons, to be an agora. What's your vision of public engagement for the RBCM to help mitigate that risk?
I'm quite old-fashioned, I suppose, in that I rather like human interaction. I actually think, and the Royal BC Museum is very interesting because it has these 600 volunteers, active volunteers. Most of them are over 80, which could be perceived by some people as a problem. So, the opportunity is to have humans connect, because then you can really pitch your knowledge to the group, to the individual. You're going to talk differently to a war veteran and very differently to a young child, etc. And so the opportunity, my vision really is around having people working in the galleries. You actually see museum staff in the galleries. I'm not talking about curators. I'm talking about, the sort of North American model of interpreters. I don't know what you'd call them, because nobody likes particularly the word interpreter. It sounds like, somebody working at the UN translating from Arabic to English or something. But the idea that there's somebody in the gallery, that these galleries aren't just empty, but there are actually people available. At the Museum of London, where I was director for 10 years, we brought in iPads for all the staff to use as an opportunity of creating a relationship between person and object. I mean, ultimately, you want people to engage with objects. Ultimately, you want people to slow down in a museum and begin to look at things. In Victoria, the pace is quite slow to begin with. It's very different to London. So in a way, we're halfway there, if you like. But what we do need to do is to make the museum design engaging too. So to light the object beautifully, to place it in a context, to write something about it that will actually engage people. I suppose, we haven't done the basics yet So the idea that we're already moving digitally, I think, is a very tall order for a museum. We don't have the beautiful showcases yet. Yes, it is a beautiful museum. You know, those types of dioramas are still engaging. The public love them. But actually, in terms of museum, we leave the museum and we don't really know what the highlights of the collection are. You know, people leave the museum and they think the mammoth is the real object. And I think that's, you know, where we've gone too far, in a way. We need to come back to being a little bit more of a museum, my sense is. And you can do that around, you know, use your temporary exhibitions as your strategy to evolve that type of culture, that type of thinking, because it is a new type of culture that's coming in. Listen, folks, thank you all very much for your patience and for engaging with me and for allowing me to speak. Thank you all very much.